Margaret is the older girl, and she's 18, and the younger girl is just 13. That's Agnes. And just to confuse you with yet another name, the angel above is looking down, and of course there's a lovely wee lamb too. What happened was Margaret and Agnes were daughters of a man down in the southwest of Scotland who adhered to the Reformed faith. He, like others in his area, were very devout holders to that faith. And unfortunately, the government said, no, you must submit to the Episcopal form. It is illegal to worship the way you're worshiping. So the two girls were arrested, and they were sentenced to die. However, the father was able to pay for his youngest girl, pay her way off the execution block. The older girl, Margaret, was executed not by having her head chopped off. She was executed with another lady, a 60-year-old lady by the name of Margaret McLaughlin. And Margaret McLaughlin and this Margaret were actually tied to stakes in the middle of the Solway Firth, where the water comes in deep and fast. They were tied to stakes at low tide, and when the waves and the tide came in, they were drowned in the Solway Firth, drowned for their faith. They're known as the Wigton Martyrs. And do you want to say anything else, madam?
You left a little.
What?
You left a little.
Oh, good.
Actually, I think the parents were of the Reformed faith, but they submitted to the Act of Uniformity. But the kids would not. He had 3 children. They had a son, I think his name was Thomas, and they had 2 daughters, Margaret and Agnes. And the son avoided capture, and actually after it was all over would come back and take over his father's lands and reclaim them. But the daughters became very active and would actually follow around and just stay ahead of the soldiers and the various guards that were trying to arrest them. And they came to the coast, and they became friends. They came under the influence of an older lady, a widow by the name of Margaret McLaughlin. Actually, her name was Margaret Milliken. McLaughlin was her maiden name that she had reverted back to once she became a widow, but her married name was Margaret Milliken. And they were arrested. Agnes was purchased out. By the way, the father of these 3 children, while he submitted, his children did not. They actually ended up pretty much costing him his entire fortune and estate. He was depleted because every time what they would do is come and impose a penalty on him for what his children were doing. And so they would come and take various lands and money. So he pretty much lost everything in this process. But he willingly gave it also to try to spare the lives of his daughters. Well, as was mentioned, they were decided to be put to death. So these Covenanters, these women, they were put to death on the sea by drowning. What they did was they put stakes in the sea, and then they placed and tied the women to it. And I won't go into all the details of what happened, but there was one notable thing that happened. They purposely put the older woman out further than the younger woman, so as the tide came in, she would be the first to die. And as she died, you can imagine the death that she's dying. And she is actually singing the Psalms, and then the waves would overcome her. She would gasp and choke with the salt water, and then get her voice back, and she would return to singing the Psalms, and then the waves would keep rolling in until finally she succumbs, or as she is succumbing. When they do that, the man in charge of the execution, I forgot, it was an Earl of something, he sent one of his soldiers out in a rowboat to the younger Margaret. So both of these women are Margarets. And she sent the rowboat out to the younger Margaret and he lifted her head up as the water is coming, and said that offered to her if she would recant and acknowledge the king as the head of the church and submit to the Book of Common Prayer, then and the episcopacy form of government that was being gradually imposed upon the Church of Scotland, then but if she was just merely called to do that, then she would live. And he said, "Do you not see your compatriot?" And then she said, according to eyewitnesses that were later interviewed, you'll find this most notably documented in Fox's Book of Martyrs, but also in other places. She said, "I see my Savior there with her." In other words, they said, "What do you see? You're seeing this woman die this miserable death." She says, "No, I see the beauty of my Savior." And she, like the Covenanters, remember yesterday, you remember about the Covenanters that were being put to death, such as Guthrie and others. They would, when they would die, they would say, for the crown and the covenant, meaning Christ. Christ is, he has the crown. Christ is the covenant of grace and salvation. And she utters the same thing. And so then she dies, and she also follows the model of the one that had died in front of her by singing the Psalms as they overcome her. So that was at a place called Wigtown, and they have made, this is a commemoration of, as you see, Margaret and Agnes, and the